Okay, so you think it's all about Jesus. So let's look at Jesus and what he says about it and what the teaching in the early church was about Jesus and veganism and meat eating and vegetarianism. And think you'll be quite fascinated with this one. Now, it's amazing that in the early church, some Christian groups maintained that Jesus was himself a vegetarian, according to the definition of that time, because when they talked about vegetarians, they were in many cases referring to what we know as today as vegan. Now, Eusebius states that James, the brother of Jesus, was raised by his parents as a vegetarian. Now, why would his parents do this unless they too were vegetarians as well? In church history, there were pro-meat gospels and pro-vegetarian gospels. Okay, there were more gospels than just the four gospels that we have today, or that we use today. More gospels were circulating. Okay, and some were pro-meat and some were pro-vegetarian gospels. So the Hebrew text known as the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, the Gospel of the Ebionites, as well as other Ebionite writings, recognitions of Clement, were texts that were intensely opposed to meat eating. People have often asked, what about Jesus feeding the multitude with the bread and the fish? Okay, I'm glad that you asked that question. Now, we read that in Matthew 14:13 to 21, Matthew 15:32 to 38. A careful reading of Matthew 14 reveals that Jesus only broke the loaves and gave only loaves to the people. In Matthew 14:19 in the Young's literal translation reads, having looked up to heaven, he did bless, and having broken, he gave loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitudes. In Matthew 15, Jesus specifically asks about loaves only. Okay, Matthew 15 verse 34, how many loaves do you have? In the Gospel of John, Jesus specifically asks where they can buy bread. He only asked for bread, not for fish. John 6 verse 5, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Then Jesus takes the bread and gives thanks, and the text then adds what he did with the fish. Now, it's interesting that this part of the Bible is there. What you will find is that it's actually added. It seems to have been added to the text, and it reads, Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. That's a funny sentence to add there. He did the same with the fish when nothing was mentioned previously about fish. Now, this reading seems really strange in that it adds those words, he did the same with the fish. It seems to appear like this was added later, since 2 verses later we are told in John 6 verse 13, listen to this. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Again, the fish is not mentioned at all. Most surprisingly, even Jesus, when referring to this event in Matthew 6 verse 9 to 10, mentions bread but not fish. Matthew 16 verse 9 to 10 reads, don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? And how many basketfuls you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Notice here that Jesus doesn't even mention the fish. Okay, so as you can see, this makes this story highly suspicious. Literally, something fishy is going on here in these texts. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because when the church fathers quoted the stories about what we know as the fish and the loaves stories, they only mentioned the loaves as well. So it seems like the early church, early church fathers, the early Christians, the versions of the story they had did not have fish mentioned in them. Fish was not mentioned in them. So this seems to be a later addition, because the church fathers, when they taught these stories, when they quoted these stories, didn't mention fish at all. They only mentioned bread, and it makes a lot more sense that that was the case.